Hey, what's up, metal and heavy music fans? It's Flight of Icarus again with MetalTrenches.com, and it's time for another tier list. This time we're tackling the discography of Polish death and thrash metal band Vader. But before I do that, if you like to stay up to date on the best and brightest metal bands and albums from the underground and above, then stick with me by hitting that subscribe button down below. I upload new content every single week, but let's get into the list. Alright, we're going to kick things off all the way back at the beginning with 1992's Ultimate Incantation. And this is a really solid album. This one has a great opening riff on Dark Age, just kicking off the band's entire career on a really high note. Nice transition to the Crucified Ones. The Final Massacre, though, has my favorite hook on this album. It's definitely probably the fastest, thrashiest song on the album. I'll play a little sample here. Yeah, there we go. I love those little squealy guitars. Yeah, really good stuff all over this album. I also like Chaos. One Step to Salvation have some really great riffs. Decapitated Saints has a really nice groove to it. And then I really love the church bell and the synths really kind of amping up the atmosphere on Breath o' Centuries, which is something that we will hear a lot more of as we get deeper into the discography, but it's interesting to go back and realize that they were already toying with those elements so early on. And this album took me a little while to get into just because it's got that kind of older style production. But ultimately, this is clearly an A album. I know some people would even put it as an S tier album. Definitely one of their best and a high mark to kind of kick off their whole discography with. But moving along, we've got 1995 with De Profundus, which is an absolute classic, of course. This is another commonly cited favorite album, I feel like, from most people who are fans of the bands. You got another classic riff with Silent Empire. I also love the drum break on this track. And then there's that amazing descending riff on Blood of Kingu, which is one of my personal favorites here. This is so sick. You got Sothis, which also is another kind of groovier track. Reborn in Flames is a great closer. It just sounds so evil and ominous. And I feel like this album too steps up the vocals at this point, and also already starting to see a little bit more variation in kind of the approach to each track. Whereas Ultimate Incantation was kind of like all of them sound pretty uniform. All of these start to move into kind of a lot of different directions, and I think that's really cool. I've toyed with putting this at S tier, but I'm really trying to reserve that for the albums that I just listen to over and over and over again, and so I think this is still more A tier. I think it's better than Ultimate Incantation just by a hair, but I've got some even more impressive albums that I want to reserve S tier for. Alright, then we move to 1997 with Black to the Blind, and this is an okay album. This is one that I actually had to go back, and somehow I missed it. Like, I realized as I was re-listening to these albums, I'm like, I'm not even sure I've listened to that album. Nobody talks about this album, I think, is part of it, so it was like an easy album to miss. Ultimately, it's okay. Carnal has a really cool intro to it. True Names has a really cool squealy riff, which is another thing I'm a fan of, like on that previous song that I shared. Yeah. But I feel like you can kind of hear it too. The production feels like sort of a step back. And just across the board, it's not as strong of an album as the first two. There's some cool drum parts on here. The title track has a cool hook, but again, I can see why people don't really talk about it. It's kind of just a forgettable album that is just not all super interesting. And so I think I'm going to put it at D tier. Not because it's bad necessarily, but just remember, we're trying to take this as a whole. We're only comparing these albums within the other albums of this band and not necessarily to like what I would rate it in the general like pantheon of all albums out there. So I'm going to put it at D just because I think it's one of their weakest outings. All right, 2000 though, we've got Litany, which is an incredible album. This was one of the albums that sort of got me into the band, I think. Now, this is another one where the production is kind of a mess. It's really muddled sounding, especially the bass. It's like there's way too much bass and it sounds really like flubby, but it adds a certain charm to it, and the fact that the songs are just written so well and they're so good sort of moves past that and transcends it. But yeah, especially like all the way, like just kicking off the album with Wings, as that great pounding drum intro. And yeah, the bass sounds like listen to that bass. Like that sounds really like just fake and not great, but I still can't help but get amped with the intro of this song. And there's other great ones too. Pretty much every song on this album is a banger. You got that one, you got Zephyr, you've got the title track, Litany, the final Massacre. This is where I feel like Vader first started really having those great sing-along moments that are perfect for fan participation in the audience at the live shows. The vocals really stepping up here with some really classic lyrics. But just playing a few more kind of my favorite elements here with like Zephyr, like great riffs too, obviously. Yeah, this track, like those riffs, and then you've got the moments of my litany with the accent and everything. Such a great voice, great front man. Just absolute classics all of this thing. I feel like this is another commonly listed favorite album from people who have been into the band for a long time. And of note, too, it's actually one of the highest rated on both Encyclopedia Metallum and Metal Storm. And so I'm struggling with this because I have a bunch, like this is a band that I have a bunch of albums that I really, really love. But I kind of want to put this at S tier, I think. It's just one of those classic albums and one that I come back to the most out of all of them. All right, and then we move on to 2002 with Revelations, which is another kind of decent album. This one has kind of a comparatively weak opening track, very slow. But there's other good moments on here. The Nomad has like a really cool kind of marching riff to it. Very warlike, of course, a common aesthetic of the band. The cool drum breaks on Wolf Tribe I enjoy. This album also has a little bit more variety than I remember too, going back and re-listening now. Torch of War has kind of a more black metal sounding riff to it, which was kind of cool to hear. But the Code is easily the best song on here and one of their best. It's the best song on the album by far, and it's also, I think, one of the best songs that they've ever written. It's just one of the best Vader songs overall. Like that riff is so hype. It's just so good. And then this part with the little breaks with the drum. So good. I freaking love that song. Like, I cannot listen to it without just going all out and having a really great time with it. But yeah, it's totally infectious. And yeah, so again, solid album. Not quite as memorable as some of their other ones. I was kind of struggling thinking about where I wanted to place this. Ultimately, I think I'm going to put it at B tier. It may end up dropping down a little some once I put everything up here, because I kind of want to like play around with it and see what really makes sense. But for now, let's move on to 2004 with The Beast. And this is one that I feel like is one of their weakest too. Has a really dull opening song. Firebringer's okay, but ultimately, like, this is a really just sort of bland album in my opinion. There's not a lot that stands out about it. It's pretty forgettable. I do like the track The Zone. Like, The Zone has like a pretty solid classic Vader riff. It's enjoyable to listen to. It's probably the only song that like really stands out to me. But even like this one is like a little bit on the slower side too. It's definitely not like one of their best songs. And again, not a really great album. I don't have a ton to say about it even. So I'm going to put that one at D tier. It's, again, another one that I just barely listen to at all and just don't have a particularly good time with. But that is going to switch over with 2006 with Impressions in Blood, which is a fantastic album. Easily an S tier album. I'm just going to go ahead and throw it up there now. This was another one I think got me into the band. I also recall, like, as I came into these guys a little bit late, but I remember seeing this album cover everywhere and being super intrigued by it. It is just such a 2000s album cover, very much of the time. And I love this one because they really started to toy with those symphonic elements on this one a lot, and is an outlier in that way. Like, this album sounds very different from, I think, a lot of their other albums, and I think it pays off. They've got that incredible opening with the strings on Between Day and Night rolling straight into Shadow Fear, which is just such a bombastic, epic moment to behold. And it's like you already know you're in for something special when you hear these strings. It's like, that, whoa, that's different. That's not usual Vader. And then it kicks right into this awesome head bombing riff. Head bobbing, I should say. Yeah, so good. And then you've got As Heavens Collide, which is great. Hallelujah, though, is another one of the best songs ever. If you make a list of like the top 5 Vader songs, Hallelujah has to be in here. Again, this album not only is full of these cool symphonic elements, but so many... Judd, hallelujah! It's Judd! It's Judd! Hallelujah! Like that whole just amazing sing-along moments. Like, I can just see everyone in the crowd just throwing up their fists to that part. Yeah, this album just sounds massive, and the cover art is by Seth Cyro Anton of Septic Flesh fame. Warlords, They Live is another classic, I feel like. This is also probably like their most ambitious album to date, maybe rivaled by just one other that I'll get to in a minute. But yeah, all around, I love this album. It deserves to be at S tier. It is easily one of their best, and sometimes I've toyed with deciding whether I think it is their best. But let's go on to 2009 with Necropolis. This is another solid album, but also another one of their kind of like forgettable ones. And I feel like we start to see a pattern emerge here a little bit with like an alternation between like really good albums and then kind of so-so albums. But we've got some good tracks on here, especially Never Say My Name, which they had a music video for, and I feel like that was another factor that I recall seeing that music video and being more intrigued by the band, because I'd heard them before, but hadn't really spent like time with them at that point. But this one has a nice dark-sounding riff, and as I recall, the music video has a lot of like the Last Supper imagery and like crucifixion and all that. And just overall, that's sort of the theme of the album. It's a very evil sounding, satanic themed album. Definitely comes across. We Are the Horde, Impure, also great songs on here. But it's not quite as consistent as some of my favorites. The interludes on here are a unique and interesting touch because you don't really hear a ton of just pure standalone interludes on Vader albums. When Sun Drowns in Black is also a nice closer, another very dark, ominous, big sounding track. I kind of want to put this album at B, I think. Let's go to 2011 with Welcome to the Morbid Reich. Now, I'm probably going to upset some people here in that I'm not a big fan of this album. I know some people who absolutely love this album, just will list it as one of their favorites, but I'm just not one of those people. Like, something about this album just kind of bores me. But that's not to say that there's not good elements on it. Come and See My Sacrifice has a great riff on it. Yeah, like, that's a really fun, just high energy riff. There are good elements like that on this album. Also, I Am Feast on Your Soul has kind of a more dramatic edge to it. And then there's some really cool vocals on I Had a Dream, which is probably my favorite track on the album if I had to choose it. More like sing-along moments on this one. Some nice variation in the songwriting, a lot of cool riffs there. It's one that I liked more re-listening to it again, but it's just still not like one of my favorite albums to listen to. Lord of Thorns is also decent, so it's sort of a mixed bag. Like, to me, though, it's just sort of okay. But here's where I start struggling, though, because it's like I kind of want to put it at C tier, but then it feels sort of wrong to maybe put it below Revelations. So I'm going to have to think about this a little bit. I'm going to put it at C for now and see what we decide at the end here. All right, and then that brings us to 2014 with the absolute masterpiece that is Tibi Et Igni. I freaking love this album. This is the album ultimately, like, I know late on, like, I'd been listening to these guys for a while, but this is the one that ultimately sold me. Like, this is the one that made me want to go back and really give a solid listen to all of their albums, because it's just so damn good. And it's another standout in that it's very cinematic, but also very heavy. I do feel like it has some kind of, it's almost like a spiritual successor to Impressions in Blood, but just on a completely different style still. It almost feels like you're traversing this burning hellscape that you see on the cover art. This is an S tier album. There's so many amazing songs on here. There's really not a bad one. Just starting right from the beginning with Go to Hell has this very, again, cinematic, dramatic opening to kick things off, and then straight into those really thrashy riffs. Triumph of Death has this amazing thrash riff that I absolutely love to death. And also one of my favorite sing-along moments there. We're marching on to the grave. So good. Hexenkessel, another just very, like, ambitious, powerful, impressive track all around with these marching riffs and the strings, and even some of the, like, the clean singing that's on here. Abandon All Hope has a lot of great moments too, and again, a lot of this, like, hell Dante-esque sort of theming to the titles and the lyrics here. But yeah, all around, I cannot say enough great things about this album. It's probably my favorite for a long time. It has been, though it's had some potential ones to supplant it. I've been all over the place just with my thinking of what is my favorite Vader album, and it's up there. But to avoid just gushing on and on about it, let me move to 2016 with The Empire. And this is an album I had high expectations for, coming off of Tibi Et Igni and just loving that one so much. But ultimately, I was kind of disappointed because this just completely steps back from the ambitious side of that album. It's a much more stripped back, simple, back to basics kind of album. And as a result, it feels a little bit generic to me. It's more of sort of a straight thrash album almost, which is not my favorite thing in the world. And a lot of, like, more boring sort of mid-paced songs. Yeah, see, like, this is like almost the whole song. And, like, yeah, it's kind of fun and it's a little different. But there's just a lot of songs like that where it's just very slow, very methodical, and that's just not what I come to Vader for. Like, I come for balls to the wall, high energy, evil sounding music. So when you give me stuff more, yeah, like the Armageddon and Send Me Back to Hell, like, it's just not really my speed. And even though this one is faster in parts, it still just comes across as very generic, stuff they've already done before and done better. And yeah, it's not a bad album. I liked it a little bit more, again, kind of on the re-listen. There are some really killer solos on here too, but ultimately I think it kind of just lacks that, like, visceral Vader feeling that I get from most of the other albums. And so it's definitely better than these two. I want to put it at C. I think that feels pretty fair. And that brings us to present day with 2020's Solitude in Madness. And it's rare that I do this with a brand new album, but this is also S tier. Fantastic. Just, I could not believe how good this album was. Like, on the flip side, I had low expectations going into this one just because I was so disappointed by The Empire. And holy cow, like, this album is incredible, and you can actually check out my full form review of this in one of the album roundups. I'll put a link for that up above. But there's not a bad song on this album. And like I said, Tibi Et Igni has been my favorite album theirs for a very long time, but I think it's starting to be rivaled by Solitude in Madness. As you can see, I've hearted like almost every song, and there's just so many amazing riffs and also amazing sing-along vocal parts. They really outdid themselves, especially being so late in their career. I mean, it's just fun when you get to the chorus on this one. It's so good. You got Despair, Incineration of the Gods. Like, it's just like non-stop. This whole album goes at 11 without like wearing you out. And there's also enough variation in the riffs too that keep it more dynamic and interesting. I love this one too. Sanctified Denied. It's one of my favorites. Satan Wept. Another nice kind of marching, warlike riff. Dancing in the Slaughterhouse has some great riffs and sing-alongs again. Just fast, furious, incredible stuff. I love this album. I am so impressed that... I'm always impressed by bands that so late in their career can deliver, like, not only great albums, but potentially some of the best in their discography ever. So, looking at this now, I kind of want to like shift things around a little bit because it feels a little wrong whenever I have so many albums in S tier. I think I kind of want to drop... Oh, wait. How'd that happen? How'd that get down there? Oh, I'll have to rewatch when I'm editing and see how that moved down there. That was not supposed to be there. So I kind of want to move Litany down here just because I want to reserve S for really the top. And I feel like these three have become like my triad of greatness. And then these three feel like a nice A tier 3. And sort of in that order too. I like Litany, then De Profundis, then Ultimate Incantation. And then... does this... I mean, I guess this feels pretty good. Yeah, I feel pretty strong about this. Again, my opinion often matures and changes over time, but right now I feel like this is sort of where I stand in terms of the Vader discography. But now I'm really interested to hear, what do you all think down in the comments? What are your favorite Vader albums? What are your least favorite albums? How would you rank them? But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.